So Jeff, it's a pleasure to have you here. I know that you are one of the persons here in Hollywood that there is the biggest background in film financing. You come from Comerica Bank. So my first question for you, share with the audience a little bit about your background in film financing, your history in this field, and we can go from that.
Sure. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, Fabio, and hello, everybody. Tudo bem? Yeah, my background is primarily in film and other media finance, going back 35 years or so. So I worked at a few commercial banks. I helped build and start two groups at commercial banks, the last one being Comerica Bank. I've had a little boutique advisory since 2000, so a little more than 20 years now. And I also had a joint venture with Citigroup out of their investment bank called Continental Entertainment, where we went a bit more up and down the capital structure and provided debt, but also provided mezzanine and equity and P&A financing and other types of financing. So my advisory business is largely having to do with capital and strategy around media and entertainment companies. And I have a long background through the banks and otherwise of financing individual movies as well and television projects. And today, I think a little bit on topic for our discussion is, like everybody, I'm trying not to be a dinosaur and get stuck in the old model and look forward to the new models.
Oh, this is very helpful. So you probably can talk better than me about the past, but in the beginning, the studios that were built here in California, they started to finance movies, and at certain point, they started to hire productions outside of the studio and do these negative pickup agreements. And after that, also independent producers started to figure out models in order to get the films financed. Can you tell a little bit about this model from the past? So how work the negative pickup agreements and how independent film producers used to be financed, let's say, in the beginning of film financing?
Yes, exactly. You're 100% right, Fabio. When I was a baby in the business, in fact, it was, as you say, the studio model was what was called a negative pickup, which essentially meant the financing occurred around one distribution contract with typically one of the Hollywood major studios, and then they in turn, sub-distributed those rights or distributed them directly wherever they had a geographic footprint. Those deals were quite simple in a way, quite complicated in the sense that you're dealing with the studios. Some of that has not changed. Studios are still challenging, but in the 90s in particular, you started to see the evolution of what would be known as kind of a split rights model, which meant that in the early days in particular, that typically divided between the domestic rights, meaning the US and Canada from a Hollywood-centric perspective, and then all the international rights. And as that continued to proliferate, you saw the entrance into the marketplace of other types of businesses, the international sales agents, who then, for an independent producer, would represent those rights globally in about 40 or more territories, and go to markets like Cannes, in those days, some of the festivals, but these days it's Cannes, Berlin, and the American film market for the most part, and to license those rights over various territories. And then the producer, an independent producer, would typically take that basket of contracts and try to monetize it, often through banks. And one thing that hasn't changed is it continues to be a capital-intensive industry. So if you go back to the original days of the Hollywood model and the studio negative pickups, what happened was the films became larger and larger, and many of the studios were owned by larger corporate conglomerates on a global basis. And so they all had pressures to find other ways to defray some of that cash outlay on products. So they started turning to banks as a means of third-party financing. And then as things progressed into the 90s, you had, as I said, these split right deals. And from that, from a financing standpoint, you also had financiers who were willing to lend money, banks, for example, to lend money against these sort of pre-commitments or pre-sales internationally and domestically. And then you also had banks, which I was part of at Comerica in the 90s, who did a lot of what in those days was called gap financing, where you also had a certain number of yet to be sold or unsold rights. And based on that and the sales agent, the bank would take a judgment as to what they thought was a reasonable risk to take against those remaining rights that were going to be sold, typically after the film was in production or nearing completion. And then as we go forward, of course, we can talk about this a little bit more. We've obviously changed again with the advent of streaming. But in those days, going back to the 90s, what you really saw was also a combination of technology and deregulation in certain markets. In Europe and other places internationally, the television markets, deregulated very much, and you went from the old kind of network model, which also existed in the US back in the 70s and 80s, where you only had, very few choices, to suddenly you had more choices in television, including in the 90s, a real rise in the value of pay television. Again, a lot of that has been supplanted as we flash forward with the streaming model, but you had in the 90s, in these split right models, you typically had, in many cases, some US or US and Canada combination, some international rights that needed to be financed. And you also saw the early days of incentives and subsidies and what bankers often call sort of soft monies, which is a basket of incentives that were designed by different jurisdictions to attract production to their geographic area.
So like trying to resume what you said, so in the past, this split model was based in pre-sales. You mentioned the gap, the unsold rights that normally the bank can take the risk or not, kind of grants or tax incentives or tax credits, so different kinds of private equity film financing, and I think pretty much this was the model in the past. And I think what we saw from that to nowadays, I think we had in the middle also the surging of alternative modes of financing, such as crowdfunding, such as some financing in specific jurisdictions that retain portion of the rights. So Brazil used to have some film finance, was not a typical production incentive that you just produce and get your incentive, but you need to park some of the rights in Brazil, and splitting the rights, you could also use soft money from that. So can you talk a little bit about this middle, so this crowdfunding? I don't know how long did you follow this specific?
Yeah, I mean, I think there has been, an increasing place for crowdfunding in film, and that's taken, various forms. You can think of Kickstarters. There are whole platforms like Indiegogo that have had more of a focus on film, perhaps. And in general, this is true for crowdfunding as a resource, because you see even in other entrepreneurial startups and other things, this is quite popular. In addition to that, you've had over the years many different forms of tax investment structures, ranging, this happened in the 80s in the US, and the US even had a specific Rule 181 for a while that was a tax sort of motivated investment scheme for investors. The UK is quite steeped in this kind of a history, most recently with the Enterprise Investment Scheme, or EIS financing, which is now sort of in its twilight and phasing out for film completely. But yes, and in France, for example, you have the Sofica structures. So yeah, there are various forms of financing, including crowdfunding, and these have become quite popular. And I think they have a great presence in documentary films as well, because typically these are ones that are sometimes initiative or issue or cause driven, and that's a good overlay with crowdfunding typically, because in the old days, documentary funding really relied completely on sponsorship or somebody with private equity who championed an issue, and those things still exist, but crowdfunding has helped because it's just helped the reach of that cause or that issue or that topic.
Yeah, I think what we saw also in this middle, I think this is not a lot in the US, but we saw a lot in Europe and we saw a lot in Brazil, was the co-production kind of deals. No, so countries that have co-production with other country, and they use these official treaties in order to get soft money from different jurisdictions. So probably you saw a lot of combinations of this kind of money, and also some private equity, or also some pre-sales or something that kind of built at this point the film financing as well. So
you're quite right. In fact, it's kind of funny, as someone who lives in the US but who's done a lot of business internationally, in the early days of my exposure to sort of soft monies, it was really through these tax treaties, Canada, Canadian UK deals, Irish, other European entities, South America as well. Yeah, so that was kind of where the bulk of that activity occurred. And then ironically, more recently in the US, I don't think it's quite at this number now, but not so long ago, it was up to something like 40 or more US states as well, had their own jurisdictional incentive structure, and a lot of times production and production services follow those models, because typically when you have a treaty or you have just soft money that relies on a jurisdictional spend, you typically need a good co-producing partner in that territory that quickly becomes an expert in this topic, because they realize that they have to justify that spend ultimately to the capital behind the project. And because a lot of these deals now have become quite sophisticated, and the good news is a lot of them are quite readily monetized, either by banks or private equity or mezzanine sort of deals. So there's good access to capital around these soft money structures, which has only furthered the use of them.
So fast forwarding a little bit, we saw, let's say, before the pandemic, the surging of the streaming platforms, and they start to be, let's say, the new studios on the marketplace. So like platforms such as Netflix that don't used to be a big US studio, become a US studio, and start to produce quite a lot. And the business models of these platforms was pretty much licensing agreements. So they were in the beginning buying license for some of the contents, what pretty much was inserted in the old system. So if you have, let's say, a film to finance, you pre-sale your movie to some jurisdictions for some streaming services, and you can get the financing and after deliver, so you do everything. But with the pandemic with us, and people going straight to the streaming, so not going to the theaters anymore, the system kind of collapsed and started to go straight to PSA. So companies, production companies being hired by streaming platforms to produce and deliver, and pretty much not retain any right on that film or TV production. So can you talk a little bit about this moment? So what's happening between the old business model coming to this streaming PSA model? So can you try to remember and share with us a little bit?
Yeah, I think if you look way back, the reality was the business was controlled by very few parties, right? And really, what you've seen over the course of time is the combination of technological advances with consumer behavior. And so consumers basically want the product, you know, they know what they want, they know when they want it, and then they know how they want it. So now we live in a world of 24/7 consumer demand, and what you see in response to that is an incredible demand for content. And Netflix is perhaps the best example, because they started as a rental company that was delivering DVDs and physical goods. And then in 2007, they switched over to a streaming model. And there were many people who were suspecting that they were going to fall, because they were spending in those days, somewhere between $1 and $2 billion on content annually. And everyone thought that was an eye-popping figure. And you look today and they're spending 20 billion. So the market has exploded. I think you're 100% right, Fabio, that the advent of the pandemic only furthered that. And I think, this is here to stay. The question looking forward will be how many competitors are there, how they choose to compete, if there will be a need for third-party financing for some of them. I think you have some parties like Apple and Amazon that may or may not want to take advantage of third-party financing. They happen to sit on a lot of cash. You have Netflix, which is still doing licensing deals and also funding product directly. But yes, third-party producer, it's a good time to be a supplier of content. And then the key is to, build your resume and build your relationships, with these huge outlets now that are requiring this level of content. But it's a very good time to be a supplier of content and an owner of physical studios as well, because all of these productions need to be shot somewhere. One of the other interesting technological advances on the production front are the virtual production stages, which I think my projection is these will definitely replace a green screen technology. And then I think they won't replace everything, but I think there are certain genres where they really fit very well right now, especially in the fantasy and sci-fi arenas. You think of the sort of marquee products that have been shot this way already, like The Mandalorian, and others. So I think, and the LED technology has really driven that ability to shoot. And from a creative standpoint, I think it's quite interesting too. Having talked to a lot of directors, they say creatively it's much better because the actors and the director are playing off a real background that they can see, as opposed to a green screen with a tennis ball.
Oh, this is very good. I think technology will be changing a lot, and the landscape also with the creation of the virtual reality devices and all these sort of things, the metaverse and etc. So let me ask you one more question. So after the PSAs with the platforms, I was in a meeting with someone a couple of weeks ago on a platform, and they told me, oh, our differential as a platform would be now start to let's say let the producer stay with part of the rights. So because there's so much competition for content in these platforms, there is a really everybody's running to sell their content. But when you have a huge competition and you have few platforms buying, so some platforms can say, okay, I'm buying this rights for a certain time, or I'm buying just for the streaming window, and you can explore other things, let's say theaters or products or something related with the content itself, and give to the producers and to the actors or directors some residuals that can come from this thing. So probably this will be the next phase. What do you think? Or do you think that we have straight PSAs forever?
No, I agree with you. I think that there already has been for a little while now some sort of unspoken acknowledgement that certain in-demand creative talent could demand some changes to the normal approach taken by streamers in recent years, which has been to really just sort of own everything, and you're a producer for hire, and thank you very much, and you move on and you take your margin for producing, and it's over. But I agree that with more competition, this should improve from a producer perspective. And I think it starts with the most in-demand content, as you would expect. And I think it takes two angles. One is for the creative talent, and one is for the sort of deal structuring or licensing windows. And I think both of those, should see only continued impact of the competition where you see more fragmentation.
Yeah, I would like to hear two more things before you go from your side. One is this new streaming player. So what we are seeing now in the landscape is Netflix plus all the old Hollywood studios with, let's say, reshaped platforms, like Universal with Peacock, or HBO Max with Warner Brothers and Disney. So, but we are seeing like surging platforms that say they are related with the LGBTQ community, or they're related with, let's say, action movies or terror movies, or something related with NFT or blockchain. So we saw platforms doing that. So how do you think that will be the future? Do you think that these small platforms will be a big player in the game? So the audience is going also to let's say subscribe small platforms, or maybe they work with advertisement. How are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite an interesting market landscape at the moment. Obviously, the major studios all have it in their strategic plans to have some form of a streaming platform, and thus you see each one of them has some version of a streaming platform, and they are trying to use it in different ways. Maybe Disney Plus is one of the more effective ones, because they cut across a lot of demographics with sports, family, and other content. But you also see, Netflix is there because they were an early mover, right? And they've done quite well, and they've tried to, create sort of sub channels and different specialized channels. But I think in the context of the society moving from sort of cutting the cord and getting content from wherever they can get it, I see you probably will continue to see a market fragmentation in the audience as well, because the content is accessible. So that creates many opportunities for more targeted content, which is a great thing. I mean, you look at where documentaries are, and the access to documentaries, and the access to capital and distribution for documentary filmmakers compared to 10 years ago, it's like night and day. It's fantastic. And so I think that will continue. And you certainly have already, most countries have seen this in, maybe the less exciting areas of that, like home improvement and other sort of specialized content. And I think any of these, common issue groups and audiences that form, if the audience is big enough and someone figures out a way to deliver it directly, I think there are great opportunities there.
This is very good. And one last thought that I want to hear, since we are talking most with the Brazilian audience, is about international content. Let's say that in the past, for the US point of view, the domestic market was way more important than the international. But in the time being, this is start to revert. So the international starts to become even more important. And right now, we are seeing streaming platforms hiring people in the territories. I know that Netflix has hundreds of people working in Brazil, and also Disney, and also other platforms. So and not just in Brazil, but in Europe, in countries in Asia. So they start to hire local content and spread the local content to the world. And the international, let's say, earnings is important, but also you start to have this importance in international content. So something like Money Heist or Narcos, or content produced outside of the United States, that become a hit in the United States and all over the world. So how do you think this can affect the landscape and the future of film financing? So I think this is a great thought.
I think it's a
Brazilian
fantastic. I think it's a fantastic development. You know, if you think about what film and television are at their roots, it's really storytelling. So what you see is an ability to tell great stories that come from anywhere, that can reach a global audience. So this is a great time to be in the content supply business and in the creative business in this sense. With regard to localized content or regionalized content, I think the studios have played, in varying degrees to try to support localized content or not, and they've had some successes. They've pulled back at times. They've been in and out, but this overall trend that you mentioned was happening well before the pandemic in terms of the flip of global revenues and the what used to be the majority of them being driven by the US and Canada market. And Canada represents typically about 10% of the US market, but so let's just say the US for the moment. But I can think of films like the remake of Mad Max is a good example, where on a very large sort of Hollywood production scale, you saw films that were modeled quite differently. And it even, in my view, it even filtered into the content itself, in the sense that it played well with these large action movies where the dialogue wasn't as intense. But clearly that was a movie that was made for the international market and the global market. And I think this is the new paradigm. And so the pandemic, I think, only furthered that, because then, of course, you had people seeking through streaming and using that technology, people being able to find content that was more relative to them in terms of cultural context, language, different things. Whereas in the past, if you look at sort of, channels by language, that also existed, but now that content is so much more accessible. And what's great about that is these global stories are it's easier for them to reach an audience. So this is a wonderful development.
Yeah, we saw, I think Narcos was a big case for that. No, they have like this Colombian series, but directed by a Brazilian. The main actor was Brazilian. You have Argentinian, Cuban, and different kinds of accents in Spanish, speaking Colombian Spanish. So it was really something, I think, for me is a landmark for the changing, I think, and the audience start to be much more comfortable with let's say different languages. I think language is not no more a big issue for film producing.
I agree, and I think the today's global audience is sophisticated. They're able to find talent wherever they find it. So this is great. I mean, I think as an anecdote of the telenovelas and the remarkable development structure that exists in a place like Turkey for global telenovelas. I mean, that's really mind-boggling. You think about K-drama, you think about all of these things, that have exploded on the marketplace. And I think that obviously is a combination of a more global society that we live in, people having interest in finding out about other cultures, other societies as well, and promoting their own, and fundamentally just finding good content and good talent wherever they can find it. So it's a great thing. And I would say the financing is lagging that, actually, but hopefully over time, either locally where that content's being produced or internationally, I hope capital does a better job of supporting those activities, because I think they're important, to spread great stories and great information globally.
So Jeff, I'd love to hear how could you help a little bit, how the content creators could understand better the film financing, how to get financing for their content, if you can help them.
think that the sort of maybe first rule for content creators, in my view, is to know who your audience is. So typically you're creating content for a somewhat specific audience. Obviously it can be a large audience, it can be a more targeted audience, but as a creator of content, I think you need to be very attentive to who that intended audience is. Once you stay true to that, which is sometimes the hard part, right? Because some opportunities come up and you think, well, that's a great opportunity, I can't pass it up. However, it might not be the right opportunity for that content. But with regard to streamers in particular, you know, I think you have to be prepared as a content creator, and especially if you're early in that process, you have to be prepared to hopefully get the attention of the streamer and know, you know, do your homework on the streamers as to why they might like that kind of content. We've talked recently about, you know, the fragmentation of that market within the streamers. So try to understand who does what and who does what well, and in terms of different types of content. Be prepared as maybe a new entrant in that space, that you might have to, you know, you might have to give up a lot to break into that space. And those can be hard choices, both creatively and commercially. But sometimes those realities are the reality. A lot of the streamers, for example, in the sort of TV terminology of a showrunner, you know, a lot of the streamers have people that have had successful content with them, so they're already seasoned with the streamer, they're known, they're trusted. So that's probably not a bad place, especially in the episodic world, to target, you know, somebody who's already worked with that streamer. If that's the streamer you're intending to go to, that's one avenue in. You know, people, for good or bad, you know, take on people with name value as executive producers, get their production companies involved somehow. A lot of those kinds of examples aren't as specific to streamers, but they still exist, because, you know, any distribution platform values, you know, name value, and how that's going to play with their audience, and because the streamers evaluate their own audience as well. So you want to try to find the best overlap between your content and how the streamer views their own audience to get their attention.
So one thing for us to wrap up and finish. So can you share a little bit about what you have been doing now, and maybe we have like Brazilian production houses watching you. I don't know how it can be helpful, or anything that you think in this way. So can you share?
Yeah, I mean, I regularly am involved in, as I said, things that have strategic agendas, and things related to capital. So at the moment, you know, I have a client that's a sizable fund out of Europe, that's a non-bank debt fund. I have clients that are in the mobile platform arena. I've recently had clients in the animation space, in the gaming space. Let's see. There are some great opportunities, I think, in markets where they didn't have a lot of the same history. Their trajectory has been different. You know, places like Africa, where they quickly leapfrog, I think, to mobile platforms, and I think there are more markets like that. I've been active over the years in the Middle East, and in Asia, like I mentioned, K-dramas and other things. I think you'll continue to see some proliferation of that. That really started, I think, somewhat, you could argue, with Japan, but now it's sort of migrated to other parts of Asia. So I'm excited, because, you know, the world's you know, an ever-changing place and landscape, and, you know, as I said, capital needs to be attentive to that, and strategically there are great opportunities for people anywhere, because you can find your audience.
So this is really good. Thanks for your time, Jeff. I think it was great. Thanks for sharing your knowledge with the Brazilian and the world audience that are following the FestCampos Festival. Thank you very much.
Obrigado.